Okay. So, like I said already today, I want to go through this example application and walk through first what the existing jQuery is doing, and then start chunk by chunk writing tests for the behavior that's already there, and start to discuss sort of the pain that I feel and experience as I write this stuff. I've already got everything out in little tiny commits, so instead of spending time, fighting with typos, I'm going to kind of introduce one little new block of testing at a time. All the tests that you see today are written using Jasmine, but it's been mildly augmented by the different scripts that I've written over time that add stuff onto Jasmine. So if you're interested, or if you're confused, or if this differs from other Jasmine examples that you've seen, that's intentional. Lineman applications come with 3 helpers here that I've written. One is called Jasmine Fixture. It helps you throw stuff onto the DOM in a way that the test is going to clean up afterward for you. You basically supply a CSS selector, just like you supply jQuery a CSS selector to find stuff. You provide a CSS selector, and it'll make stuff. It's like you can just say, I want foo space div pound thing, and it'll make you something with the class foo, and then a descendant that is a div with the ID thing. It's very slick and very concise, and the reason I wrote it is because shared fixture files, or people saving out these big HTML files and loading up in their tests, leads to less clear, less maintainable tests. Another add-on that you'll see a little bit is Jasmine Given. It's inspired by our hometown hero Jim Weirich's RSpec Given library, and it lets you write all your tests in given when then syntax. So I typically don't use it blocks and before eaches in my Jasmine tests or in my RSpecs, because I think given when then is a little bit more obvious, and you'll see what that looks like. In general, one of the things I like about given when then, other than the fact that every statement that you do is one line and you can easily pull up and pull over and refactor around everything, it tends to be much denser. So with Jasmine, especially if you're writing Jasmine in JavaScript, I can very often run into, because of how many just nested functions you have, run into like about a 4-to-1 ratio of lines of test code to lines of application code, and that can just be very intimidating to somebody who's new to testing, period, much less JavaScript testing, to see this much test code to wrap up this much production code. Jasmine Given produces much denser specs, which means you have to read them a little bit more slowly. I guess that can be separately intimidating. Jasmine Stealth is something that you kind of only see between the lines. This adds a whole lot of testable functionality to Jasmine spies that they don't include out of the box. The most important one is conditional stubbing. Like, I want to stub the return result of this function that is fake, but only when you pass it these arguments, or only when its object satisfies these conditions. Another thing that it can do is it can spy on constructors, which is handy if you're using something like Backbone, which uses the new keyword to actually instantiate something from a function. So by spying on a constructor, you can fake out some in total like Backbone model or some Backbone view, and have a complete fake from the get-go, which is strangely difficult to do with Cinnamon.js and Jasmine's built-in spies. And I imagine other things too, just because of the way the JavaScript works. All right, so that's enough background. Let's show you what this little application looks like. So here I'm running lineman run. I can quit out. By saying lineman run, it's going to do all of these like development tasks for me, compile my coffee script and so forth. And then it's going to run a server on port 8000. And so if we look at this site, this is a real simple little gorgeous bootstrap site with placeholders for a username and an email and password and confirm password. And some of the behavior that it has here is it's going to do an Ajax request to check the availability of the username. So if I monitor the network here and I say Rob, I get an Ajax request back that goes to this service called account availability, and it returns an object that says available false. Turns out that in our system is so popular that the only username that works is Joe. So if we type in Joe, it'll return available true. And this is a stubbing that was just made possible. We're sending an Ajax request, but this is a stubbing that was made possible just by some configuration in our lineman app. So we can say, tell a server, hey, accept get requests at account availability /name, and then if it happens to equal Joe, send a response that available is true or false. All right, so I type in Joe. I type in, joe@schmo.com. I type in foo as my password, and then if I get the confirmation wrong, I'll get an instantaneous, little notification that my password doesn't work. This is real simple stuff. I'm sure this is the coolest sign-up form that you've ever seen. But because it's so typical and relatable and stuff that we've probably all seen before, hopefully it's a decent example to work from. Then obviously, if I click create account, it'll prevent default form submission and instead send a post request to /accounts. And if you saw it earlier, /accounts on the server side is just sending us 201, pretty much no matter what. It'll log out to the console somebody sent it. All right. So let's look at, just review the JavaScript that's driving all this behavior. It's all in one file. It's all anonymous. It's all happening on document ready. And yeah, we'll just walk through bit by bit. It sort of builds up. So the first thing that's happening is it grabs a template. This is a compiled underscore template that gets compiled at build time and is available as a function. So if I look at sign up form here, there's no dynamism here. There's no variables. It's just a static HTML. And when we first load the page, there's nothing on the page. So we go and we grab that template function. On document ready, we look for something with the class container, and then we append to it whatever HTML results from calling that template function. Feel free to interrupt me too if I gloss over anything, or if anything's new. I think a lot of this example is going to assume that this is not earth-shakingly new practice. Second thing that it does, you might have noticed that the URL changed when I hit localhost 8000 to hash accounts new. And that's, this is a site with one page now, but imagine if we're trying to build by hand, something that manages a kind of client-side location. Then everything else is basically event binding. The obvious one, the first thing that we'd want to hit is when somebody clicks the button, we prevent default, and then we post to accounts some serialized copy of the form. So this is just serialized, we'll take all the form elements, it's a built-in jQuery thing, and create a URL encoded query param for them. And if you post with it, then all those parameters will come up as normal post params, form data. The second event handler here is when the input login changes, we grab whatever was typed in, and then we go and hit this account availability service that we already looked at. And if it's Joe, or if it comes back true, then we pop over available, and if it's not, then we say this name's taken. And display it in popover form. And that display popover stuff down here is actually using Bootstrap.js. I already pulled in Bootstrap, so I figured why not. Uses Bootstrap.js to first destroy anything that's there, put up the new content message, and then show. Let's see. The last one, password confirmation. Whenever that changes, we look up the password. We look up the password confirmation from the target because that's the thing that generated the event. And if the password doesn't equal the password confirmation, then we give them a popover that's a warning. And if it does equal, we clear any popover that might have been there just by calling destroy to the Bootstrap popover function. Any questions about what this code's doing? All right. When I first talk to people about testing JavaScript, the vast majority have code that looks like this because the vast majority are coming from like a server-side dominated world. I know that you guys at Sparkbox are really have a focus and a passion for the front end that a lot of shops lack. So this might not resonate with you so much, but most of the jQuery and JavaScript that's being written today worldwide, I'm sure, looks more like this than it looks like an Ember app or a Backbone app or something that's structured into lots of small units and files. So usually when I talk about unit testing JavaScript, people are imagining how to write specs directly against something like this under the presumption that what they need is tests, and any pain or problem that they experience in trying to write those tests is a reflection of the quality of the testing tool or their ability to do testing, and not a reflection of the quality of the code that they're trying to test. I think one of the big lessons of TDD in particular is when you experience pain in your tests, It's a moment to reflect, because what it's really saying is that if it's hard to test, it's hard to use, and if the code is hard to use, then maybe the design of your code isn't so hot. And so it's an inflection point by which you can use that as a jumping off point to start refactoring your code. Maybe get one big test for some refactor safety, and then refactor the code so that it's more testable and more usable. So I love test pain. We're going to see some test pain in a minute here, and when we do, we'll start itching for having smaller units and a named API that we can kind of call in isolation of its other parts. So first things first, we've got this describe block. I might end up going side by side. I don't know. I might just bounce back and forth. We got this describe block here. So in Jasmine, I say I want to build a little suite around this anonymous signup code. And the first thing I have to do just to make something run is issue some sort of specification. So I'm saying then is true, and that'll just give me a passing test. And now I can make sure that all the plumbing works. I can hit enter and it'll rerun all the tests in all these different environments. Actually quit Chrome, so I'm gonna rerun this, because I like using Chrome's debugger primarily, and if we run into trouble, we'll use that. There we go. All right, so I'll minimize Chrome. We'll see that we got our test passing. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and jump to the first test, or first commit that I made. One thing that you saw just a minute ago is that we had at the top level an anonymous jQuery function. That's going to happen on document ready, and because most testing frameworks, including Jasmine, run inside of an HTML document, if you do everything right at document ready, you've lost your chance to invoke it under any sort of controlled situation. And so all I did in this commit was I wrapped that anonymous function in something called init, a new function, and then I just immediately called init. That means when our tests run, all this crap is going to run immediately, but it's relatively a no-op if that container doesn't actually exist on the page. So it's not harmful per se, but it gives us at least the opportunity to call init under a controlled circumstance. Still haven't written any specs. Let's see. Scrolling up. Oh, gotta keep switching back here, it looks like. All right, so let's take a look at this first spec that I wrote. Oh, noes. All right. I shall just git stash until the problems go away. All right, so here's our first test. The first thing that our code does is it renders a view. So we'd already seen, let's split this up and hide the sidebar because it's not very helpful. We'd already seen that the first and most important thing that our code did was grab a template and render it into something with the class container. So I can tell a fix, Jasmine fixture here is a fix is the global function that it provides. I can say, put something into the DOM that has the class container. And then it'll return to me a jQuery result object, which I just save with a little this $ container. And then I can use that for subsequent assertions to make sure stuff gets put into it. So given that I have some HTML, in this class it's a div with this particular class yay. And then given that this particular JST template is a spy and it returns its HTML. So I'm just calling out here that I expect this template to exist, I expect it to use this template, and I expect it to return this HTML. I don't care so much about what's in the actual template. There's no behavior in the actual template. And so making sure that the test prints out, I've got a form and I've got this. That's going to lead to a little bit of brittleness that's no fun, because every time the template changes, your test might break, even though the template is just, flaccid markup. My actual action step here is that global function that I provided called init. So when I call init, given that I've already faked out the whole template thing and made sure that there's some place for the template to go, then I should find that something passes with the selector .yay and that it exists in the DOM. So when I run this test, I can see that that one test is passing. If I were to say, I expect there not to be anything with the yay, it'll fail, so I can be relatively confident that this is doing what I think it should. It seems to be finding it. I introduced a couple new concepts here. Use Jasmine fixture did like a little give and win then flow. Any questions or thoughts so far? Okay. This is a silly little easy addition. The next thing that happens in this page, I'm just kind of going to go down lexically. I tend to like, when I'm writing characterization specs against existing code, I just try to have it match up one-to-one as closely as possible. So the next thing that the source code is doing is it's changing the hash location on the page to accounts new. And so I wrote an additional assertion here, window location hash equals accounts new. If I had been writing this in traditional Jasmine, I would have said, and it changes the hash. And then, I would have had to write, expect window location hash to equal accounts new. And this is one of the big reasons why I prefer the Jasmine given style. That's a lot of typing when all I really mean to say, and half my tests are just left side, does it equal the right side? So if a then statement returns false in Jasmine given, it'll fail the test. That's not true of normal Jasmine specs. Everything has to use their expectation library or throw an error to fail the test. Another thing that's a little bit different is I use the keyword and here. This is a recent change in like the 2.0 series of RSpec given and Jasmine given. When you use and after a then, it will collapse everything into one test. So this setup here might be relatively expensive, or if you're doing it 1,000 times, it might become relatively expensive and slow. So instead of running that setup over and over again for every subsequent assertion, that setup will run once, when will fire once, and then this assertion runs, and then this assertion runs. Had I written it this way, it's going to do setup teardown twice and do all these setup tasks 2 times. So that's why that was written the way it was. By playing around here, I can tell that I'm going to have a bad time with the git committing. So I just stashed again to get past it. We'll just review this in Gitx. Basically, we had a little built-in helper that kind of came for free, and I just changed it to a coffee file. One thing that I added to it that was going to be a convenience for helping with some of this event binding nonsense is building fake jQuery events. This isn't technically a fake event. I'm creating a jQuery event the proper way, but I'm adding stuff to it that isn't real. So in particular, you can pass it a type, and it'll create a jQuery event for you of that type being the type of event, like click or change. And then prevent default here is a method that I probably want to make sure gets invoked. And so I just create a Jasmine spy, which is a function that monitors how it gets used. And I tack it onto that jQuery event. So added that helper, upgraded lineman, not really relevant. I didn't clean up my history much before coming over today. So next test. This test is testing user events. And so we've got a nice big describe block for all of the user events. And the first user event that we bind to is about submitting the form. And in this case, we affix to the page something with the class create account, because that seems to be sort of like the root of this template. And so everything is scoped under that class search in this implementation. So we create something with create account, and then we tack underneath that a button. So this Jasmine fixture thing can both work globally and also as a jQuery plugin. If you call it off a jQuery result object, what you'll be doing is you'll be tacking new descendants on. And something that's kind of counter-conventional but useful here is that it'll return the value, ultimately, of the last added thing. So I could have written this, but the problem with that is that I'd be getting back a reference to that outer div, that create account div, and for the purpose of my test, I really wanted an instance of the button. And so I could do that by splitting this up into 2 commands, and then I'm getting a reference to the button. Next, I create a fake event using the helper we just saw, click event. Next, I spy on, this is another Jasmineism, I basically punch out $.post, which is going to be used for the Ajax request to the server. Fake implementation is replaced, it's just a normal Jasmine spy. That means when it gets called, nothing happens, but I can go and check on it later. Another thing I did here, and this was just to kind of show how goofy when you've got lots of responsibilities all kind of tidied up into one tight little piece of JavaScript, your testable story can become kind of painful. So not only are we faking out an event and $post, we also need to fake out serialize to make sure that we're serializing the form properly. So the way I chose to do that last night was create a little spy. We're spying on $fn.serialize. That means to take the jQuery object method serialize, replace it, and then in the situation that the context, meaning the value of this when that method is invoked, has the selector create account form, then return arbitrary string, return form. That way, if somebody calls it with the wrong, like what that's saying is if I were to hypothetically say when, foo.pants serialize, that's going to give me undefined. But if I call it with exactly the selector that I know I want, which is a little bit, maybe of too tight a coupling, at least here I can conditionally stub only to make sure that the code calls in the right way. By the way, I live for your nods, so if you can nod along when you're understanding, that will help me. You've been doing great. Andy, right? Adam, sorry. All right, so the next thing that the test does, so I recognize this is quite complex looking. I mean, I just kind of glossed over it, saying when the context matches this matcher, and this is a parameter matcher called argThat, and what it does is it's just, it provides a callback, you provide it some, what this O here is, it's really the parameter or the argument. If the parameter passes this truth test, then I'm satisfied. And if it fails that truth test, it's not satisfied. So if I had said, not equals, it would have had the exact inverse effect on whether or not to stub. And if it's satisfied, then return this form exclamation mark. All right, so when I call button trigger event, then I expect prevent default to have been called, and I expect post to have been called with /accounts and form. And that's really all that we need to assert that this create account handler is doing everything that we want it to be doing. We can take a look at our tests. Now we have two tests, they're both passing. If I were to screw around with this, good. I see the failure, and I see that I'm getting undefined instead of form. So the stubbing isn't satisfied, which means I'm forced to write the right code, at least the code that I expect. Let's move on. Next test. So this is adding a test for covering the next callback. Again, I keep screwing around. It's going to be awesome to review these white space stashes later. All right. Let's take a look at the next test. Next test we wrote. This one's nice and meaty, right? Technically, this is a test against lines 17 to 23, and you can see that this is lines 20 to 39. This is a lot of tests for relatively dense code. What this usually tells me is that this code is doing a lot of stuff, maybe too much stuff, but it's covering a lot of different responsibilities, and it's also an interesting thing for us to dig into because it's doing a typical Ajax with a callback. This is something that a lot of people struggle with when they're first getting started with Jasmine. It's because Ajax is an asynchronous thing. That's the A. So a lot of tools out there, as well as sort of just the naive impression that you get when you think about how to test this, will try to get you to write asynchronous specs for that code. Trouble with asynchronous specs is that they are typically difficult to read. They can be difficult to debug. And a lot of times, the story that you're trying to tell with a test of, first I set up this, and then this happens, and then this happens, that can sort of kind of get lost in the noise of you managing when the test is done and so forth. So what I prefer to do is use spies to capture whatever callbacks happen, and then I test those callbacks in a synchronous way. So I'm going to test this callback, and I'm going to make sure that it works, and it's got an if and an else, and so it's going to get kind of sort of its own little subdescribe tested separately. Some testing frameworks, we had this discussion with Patrick earlier today. I think Mocha does a better job of letting you write asynchronous tests, and I probably would use it on Node code where asynchronous is just everything in your standard library is asynchronous. But on the browser, that's not really the case, and in 3 years now of doing Jasmine most of the time, this approach has really served me well for handling ad hoc callbacks as opposed to testing asynchronously. So let's take a look at what the spec looked like as we built it up. First, let's make sure it's a green. Yay. So first step is we have a login input and some initial value of fun, exclamation point. And we're affixing that to the same sort of scoping of something with the class create account. We have another fake event. This time it's a change type. Now we're spying on get instead of post. The way Jasmine spies work, or at least these utilities that create spies for us, is after each test runs, they get cleaned up. So if I were to use $post at this point, because I'm in a different describe block at this nesting level, even though I spied on it up here lexically, $post still works. And it would call through to the real thing. So I fake out $get. Here I create a argument captor. This is something you probably don't know about. Raise your hand if you've ever used an argument captor as part of a test double library. All right. So over in Java land, where there's lots of long-lived test double libraries, most of them have a feature like this, and I added it to Jasmine style. An argument captor is an argument matcher, like we saw argv before, is an argument matcher. It passes or fails a truth test, and if it fails the truth test, your test blows up. An argument captor is a special type of argument matcher. It always satisfies whatever gets passed to the target function, but it sort of secretly snares whatever the value that got passed was, so that you can go and play with it later and maybe run custom assertion. This is handy when you've got a function that you're trying to assert against, or if you've got a particularly complicated object that's getting passed and you want to write individual specs against that. So I'm creating a new captor called the Ajax callback, and that's all my setup. When I trigger the event, when I trigger change on that login node, I'm gonna expect $.get to have been called with this URL of account availability /fun, because that's the name that we're checking to see is available, and then I call capture on that argument captor. And when I call capture, that means that Ajax callback can be used at any point subsequent, like downstream of this test, can be used to use that function and invoke that function in isolation synchronously and not have to worry about it being asynchronous. So let's look at how we test the callback. So we've done basically, I mean, if we look back at the source code, we've verified so far that this much happens. Now we want to verify this. And this ternary that's hiding means that we have two contexts to worry about. We want to test the happy path that the name is available and the sad path that it's not. And so you can see we've got these two contexts. I use tildes typically whenever I'm testing anonymous non-named functions, just like I use hash to indicate an instance method or dot to indicate a static method. It's just a silly thing I do. I know that either way, these things are going to be calling that popover utility, and so I'm going to spy on that immediately. And because if you saw how that bootstrap popover is working, we're calling it in succession over and over again, and so I told it to return an object that has popover with the same function reference. That just makes it chainable. The spy is still there. It's still recording every invocation. All right, so let's make some white space so we can look at this closer. So in the event that the name is available, that means that basically that callback would have been called with an object that says available true. So we can just say, take the value on that callback. The value is whatever the thing that got captured is. So that's the function that we set in our source code. Ajax callback value, pass it available and true. Then we can start asserting that the popover was called how we want it to be. First we call destroy on it, then we call content available, and then we call show on it. Now this is a little bit yucky. There's several things about this that are no fun. One, it's painful. We've got like 3 lines that are really dense talking about how to use this popover. As far as me, the subject code cares about, I just want to make a popover. I don't care about the fact that I got to call this thing 3 times. So in practice, I would want to hide this behind a normal object, and maybe integration test that the popover works how I want, and then just have a one and done method that just takes a string or something. And then I've got a typo here. This is really the name is not available. The copy paste fail. When I call Ajax callback with available false, then I make sure that destroy is called, and then now the content is the names taken and show. And presumably that's all passing. And so that's pretty weighty, but once you get the hang of it and you do it a few times, suddenly like testing a particular Ajax interaction doesn't take all day. It's still painful and it's still brittle. And the reason it's painful is because this, and the reason it's brittle is because this test is testing code that's doing like 3 things. I mean, normally if I was writing Ruby code, it would stand out like a sore thumb that I was doing a network interaction, an event handling for a network interaction, that I was doing, some sort of like grabbing crap from the UI and serializing it. This is doing like 5 things at once. And it just so happens that JavaScript has so many awesome libraries like jQuery that make it really easy to do 5 things at once that we forget that makes it very difficult to test, which is part of what has increased the barrier of entry for unit testing on the front end. But it doesn't have to be that way. A lot of this stuff, like the fact that $.get takes these particular parameters, requires a callback, maybe something else could do that for us. Maybe we could write a custom object to do it. Maybe we could treat it like a backbone model and just rely on backbone sync to do all that Ajax stuff behind the scenes, and then we don't have to unit test that. We can rely on the framework to do it for us. Okay, let's move right along. Time's flying here, unfortunately. I was hoping to be going through a little bit faster, but I'm glad I'm getting a chance to explain this. Once again, gotta remember, keep on stashing all this very valuable white space. All right, last test, I believe, on this side of stuff is this behavior of the password confirmation. So to test the confirmation of the password, again, I'm going to make some room here. Make sure I got enough width. All right, so here, again, we've got this create account thing. Now that I've done this 3 times, it sort of makes sense that I should probably be affixing that way higher, maybe at this level. It's one of the reasons that it's a lot of fun to use the given syntax, because I can just rely on the fact that everything's one line, anything can be pulled up and out or pushed down and in as easily as I want. I presume that just worked. Yay, it did. All right, so I got this view with create account. I'm going to fix onto that a password input and a password confirmation input, creating another fake event that's a change event. Now I've got 2 contexts. This is much more straightforward now because I don't have some Ajax thing and a callback to come back. In the event that the password value is foo and the password confirmation value is foo, and I trigger the event, then I expect popover to have been destroyed. Basically, you shouldn't show anything if the password confirmation matches. And just to be sure, because also in our happy path, and this gets back to why we should really be hiding this popover behind some sort of function that we own, it's also calling destroy even if it's happy. So I've got an additional assertion here just to specify that this is a different behavior. Make sure it's only called once. So call count equals 1. Now if the password's mismatch, so in this case password is foo and confirmation is bar, and this event gets triggered, then I make sure, and this is a very similar 3-step assertion process, destroy, double check your password, and show. And that's that. And that was relatively painful. That took me a decent amount of time to write last night and work through and debug. And the thing that sucks about this is this test isn't testing named functions. When pain arises, we don't really get a lot of great cues about how we can improve our design, and that's because we don't have tests against an API with normal collaborators telling us whether that's painful or not. And a lot of the stubs and spies that we've done are against third-party code that's out of our control. So by stubbing against jQuery functions like $post and $get, if we have a painful experience, normally that means, oh, let's improve the design of our code. Well, I don't own jQuery, so I can't improve jQuery without forking it. And building your own API, I think Gary Bernhardt in his screencast series I've heard talks about frameworks as like infectious diseases, and what you want to do is isolate yourself from that nastiness by building some scar tissue between you and them. That scar tissue is like just like a traditional adapter pattern stuff. Build a little bit of distance between you and that framework, and that way, if the framework starts sucking, you've kind of built yourself to this contract that you own, and maybe you can mitigate that there, or maybe you can just replace the thing that you're adapting to. Either way, it puts you in the driver's seat, and the tests can help, make that pain really big and visible. So all that to say, this is how a lot of characterization tests might look if you were inflexible about changing your design from anonymous jQuery. And I realize we've only got 15, 20 minutes. I don't know if you guys normally wrap at 12:30. Oh, fantastic! Cool. I've been rushing. I might need some more water. All right. It's gonna be an epic long screencast if I post this. It's gonna take me hours to edit. Watch me post this and then not edit that. Right? It's a little meta. I'm actually planning not to edit this now. All right, so let's get Stash again. Speaking of things I wish I could edit. We're going to move on to the next thing. First of all, was there anything else in that master spec? This is one interesting little lesson. Let's just look at this inside of the diff view. We're not going to stay here long. One of the interesting rules about the new RSpec given and Jasmine given 2.x series is that you are guaranteed by those libraries that win and win statements will always execute after all of the givens have run, even if the givens come lexically later and lower than your win statements. What can be nice about this is that, say you've got a function, and let's just look at one of these examples. Yeah, say you've got a function like this availability callback. I'll check it out so we can look at it. Let's find one of these wins that got pulled up. Yeah. Here we go. You're able to pull this up, basically. Normally, you'd see this, or how this used to be, this would have been right down here. And then it would have been repeated 2 times. Sometimes you've got a function that might have 5 or 6 contexts. Depending on the input, it's going to have these different permutations of behavior that we want to verify. And you might have that win statement where you're calling the thing under test 5 different times, kind of just repeated throughout. You can dry that up a little bit and also just make the test more readable by having that how the setup differs only referenced inside each example group. So here, by saying available is true and available is false, then I can look at just this example group and see only the ramifications of what happens when it's available and what happens when it's not available. And any additional noise about, particularly in this case where we've got a lot going on when we're trying to actually trigger the behavior that we want, that doesn't get copied and pasted. It only needs to be changed in one place, and the intent of each of these context blocks becomes a little bit clearer. This isn't the best example in the world, but it's a really handy trick for writing nice, dry, intent-revealing specs. It's going to execute before. So you're guaranteed that this will have already run, and therefore this available value will already be set. Yep, prior. We did the same thing down here because both of these relied on the triggering of that password confirmation. So we just pulled that up, and then it stands in stark relief that this is the actual action under test, and these are the consequences based on changing contexts. All right, so let's switch over to some backbone. I'm going to check out the first test here. A little too far. I'm sure I'm going to have to get Stash. I really ought to be just git resetting. Oh, hey, 1 second. All right. Let's check out. I'm going to check out backbone stuff, and then I'm also going to check out the first test. And because I moved a whole bunch of files around, I'm going to assume that Lineman is going to need a helping hand and a restart to make sure it finds everything. All right. So here, now we got a bunch of little files, all doing the same thing. From the outside in, it looks like this now. We've got a main window. We still have a document ready function, but it's not doing all the heavy lifting in the world. It's just creating a new backbone router and telling Backbone to start listening to the browser's history if the hash changes in the location bar. Has everyone here seen Backbone before? Okay. I don't assume that anyone has a mastery over it. And even if you did, every Backbone application ends up looking totally different anyway. So this tries to be basic. So here I've got a router with a couple routes. One route is account/new, and another is just a default path. This cryptic star path is what you say to Backbone if you want the router to fall back gracefully onto something if no other routes match. When the router starts, it goes and finds that container for us, and then it holds a reference to that container. If the default route hits, so if somebody were to go to localhost 8000 right off the bat, they would get forwarded, and events would be triggered to actually be redirected to accounts new. And when that redirection happens, because Backbone's monitoring the history, we execute our routes, we go to new account, and then new account would get fired. So in new account here, you can sort of see the structure of how this all shook up. We have a sign up view. It has an element, and we're passing it the container object. And it has a model, which is a sign up model. And all of those are injected into the view, which means that from a testability perspective, now we control what element it cares about, and we can just inject that element or just rely on the default built-in Backbone view element. We control the model, so we don't have to pass it a real sign-up instance. We can pass it a fake Backbone model, or we can just pass it a vanilla JavaScript object, and we are in total control and isolation of the different moving parts. If you're not familiar with isolation testing, it's not scary, but it is counterintuitive that you typically want the only thing to be real that's under test is the thing that you're testing, and everything else be in complete and utter control around you. Now, I say it's counterintuitive because it sounds like you're only testing a little bit, and you could get more bang for your buck by testing all of the things all plugged together in a more integrated fashion. The problem with that is that you have redundant execution of a whole bunch of different stuff. So if you've got tests of every single class, if one thing changes in one place, it might actually knock out unit tests way across the street just because it's using real instances of all the things. Even if it changes in a completely non-significant way, you're effectively verifying it's not dry because you're verifying the behavior in many different ways in many different places. So I typically write very isolated unit tests. I probably go a little bit further than most people. So we're going to not even put in a real Backbone model. I think I usually start with a JavaScript object literal here on the test. Here I want the sign-up object because that's the one that works. And then finally, after the view is created, we render. Let's see, how else do things shake up? So if we've got this view now, we can see how the view works. It's got a template. The template's the same, just storing the reference. It's got some events. When you click a button, you call this. When you change this input, check availability. This way, we don't have to actually test it by testing jQuery's binding ability. We can just call the methods directly and expect that Backbone's going to work with these. Render function here. So every Backbone view, has an element. We just append the HTML from that return of that template. We return this. The returning this bit is just a convention in Backbone, obviously. So you can chain easily off of render. Let's see. Create account. Pretty much the same as before, except instead of doing jQuery get and then having to worry about the synchronifying this Ajax callback, we can just fire and forget to a method called save on whatever our model is and pass it the attributes that we want saved to the new resource. Check availability. This guy hasn't really changed much at all. And confirm password. This guy hasn't changed very much at all. But what you can see is that we have something called view helpers here that's going to display the popover and display the popover here. So that means that when we do write tests for this, we can hone in on just mocking out that one thing instead of 3 different interactions against that dependency. So then the only other code that I can think of is that sign-up model, which is super simple. Almost all of its behavior is just built in Backbone. The only thing we have to say is where the URL root is on the server. And this view helper, let's see, which I'd already named the file because I was poking ahead a little bit, but this view helper does two things and just hides the same behavior that we had before with the bootstrap popover. So this first test that we had, now that we're starting afresh, we did this refactor and now we're just taking a fresh look at how we might have written tests for it. I just test these popovers. The way that we tested these popovers is totally different than what we did in the first example. In the first example, we faked them out right away. And the reason we faked them out right away was they were not the primary concern. They were not the thing that we were really caring about making sure worked. We were making sure that we were using them the right way. This is a little bit different. Now that we have functions that are, their only purpose is to call through to these popovers, the assertion shouldn't be, did we call it the way we think we need to call it? The assertion can be, does it really work? Does this bootstrap popover utility that we've pulled into our application, does it have the effect that we care about, and can we verify our assumptions about it? That way, if we ever upgrade bootstrap and somehow popover goes away or popover breaks or behavior changes, if this test stays green, then our assumptions about it are still valid and we can feel relatively safe about the upgrade without double checking everything. So this I would, as I wrote this test, I realized that view helpers was a terrible name. I named stuff helpers or util as like a placeholder to tell myself that this is a terrible name. The view helpers really is popover wrapper. It's scar tissue between us and the popover, and that tells me that this test ought to be a little bit more integrated. It's a contract test to make sure that the popover works the way we want. Walking through that real briefly, our subject here is it's just a plain old JavaScript object, and it's got two static methods: display popover and clear popover. In the first example, we just need some div on the page, and we need to be able to pass to display popover the raw element of that div and a string. Our result then is to look at this next sibling. So what I did was I hopped into Web Inspector. I saw how popover was working when I visually inspected it, and I saw that what it does is it appends a sibling element to the thing that is the target of the popover, and underneath that starts printing out the text and all the fancy classes and sub-elements. So my result then is whatever that div is. And my assertion is that the text ought to be there and that it be visible. And if it's doing those things, then at the very basic level, the popover is working how I want it to work. The next function is clear popover. Here we've got another div. Really, we don't care what it is, some element, and we've got this setting, which is part of Bootstrap, to say animation is false. When you clear popover, there's like a fade out, and it's using a set timeout on it, and so testing it synchronously is difficult. So I just turned off animation in this particular example, so that when I could call destroy on it, I'd immediately know whether it got destroyed. Another setup step here is, in order to destroy the popover, we have to create one first. So on that div, which data animation is false, we say content foo and popover show. And then we clear the popover, which is really just calling destroy, and we make sure that the length is 0. And this test, took a little bit of back and forth because I wanted to make sure that it was like actually showing up on the page. So if I were to comment this out, I already have the failure here. No, popover is actually not 0. There's still a popover somewhere on the page is what it's saying. If I do have this functionality, then I can see, oh, good, the popover element has been completely removed from the DOM. Popover is working how I wanted it to. Yeah, so in this commit message, I kind of explained, oh, I've got some scar tissue. I'm going to call this popover wrapper from now on. So that's all that happens after the name. This commit's awesome because our model is super duper tiny. So we have a sign-up model, and this adds a spec called sign-up spec. And there's, oops, I still got that silly other thing that's just noise. Here it is. So this test is almost as brief as the model it's testing. The only thing that we have to test is, can we instantiate it, and does it have the URL that we expect? There's really nothing else here. Yeah, and that's all that's going to be there. Next, let's see. backbone specs. Now the real meat of this is still that view. One of the things, so this is like what I would consider a step one of a refactor away from anonymous jQuery and towards something more structured. Usually that means, if you're doing backbone, introduce a backbone view between you and that anonymous jQuery that you had before. And the view is going to start off being very, very large. So our backbone view here, if we open it up, is still doing almost all the heavy lifting. Almost all the behavior is still hiding. But by being named, by using normal functions and just sort of the object-oriented stuff in our toolbox that we normally have, now we have the opportunity to start seeing this pane a little bit more clearly. Hey, this check availability function is doing a few things. Maybe I can pull that out into a helper and just pass by reference. Hey, this confirm password thing, maybe I could just make that some aspect of forms and make a dynamic mix-in so that I need, any backbone view that wants it could maybe have an API like, just spitballing here. Maybe it would have been better to have app.add password confirmation behavior. And maybe that mixin could have handled, both this event binding and also the existence of this method, so that I can just get out of this view stuff that is not particularly special about this view. The important note, though, is that now that we've got it in the backbone view, now we've got it in a normal object, we're in total control of how we refactor from here. And when our test is painful, we can respond to that. All right. We're starting small. We're just going to make sure that we can create one of these views, that the events hash equals what we think it should. This test is just testing like that static data is on the object. It is not a particularly valuable test. Really, I do this out of rote habit, and the reason I do it is because I like to see the test go right if somebody goes in and changes this, because if somebody changes any of this, it's probably going to have some sort of other impact that I want to know about. But it's just a big part of why TDD is valuable to me is it's measure twice, cut once. And by just even copying and pasting a little bit of configuration over here, it forces me to think about it a little bit harder than it would if it wasn't there. A lot of people think that this is a totally useless test, or it's a bad thing to be here, or it's not dry. And I don't fault them, I just have a slightly different perspective, I think. The other test here is that the render function is doing what we think it should be doing. So here we spy on that JST again in just a slightly different way. And we return when it gets called, we return an HTML root. And when we call render, we expect something with the ID root to exist. Not just on the DOM, but specifically as a descendant of that backbone view. What's cool about this is that because this backbone view is all being tested in isolation, let's see if I can find that form. I don't have to worry about this create account nonsense anymore. In fact, in this whole backbone branch, I can delete that safely because no JavaScript is going to need to care about it. And another thing that's nice is that a lot of stuff, because backbone view elements start off as just living in memory, they're not actually attached to the DOM, a lot of the time you can get away with having all these tests against the DOM, quote unquote, be occurring in memory and occurring like an order of magnitude faster than if they were actually being placed in the document object. Let's see. What's next for us? Blown through nap time. Presuming I'm just going to have the stash. Yes. Backbone specs. So little red dot is here. Okay, next hardest thing. Adding a test for create account. Now remember, create account was by far the most painful test that we looked at so far in the original branch. Here it's going to be a little bit less painful. And I already previewed that. So underneath our view, we want to affix a few things to the DOM. Login, email, password. So you have Joe at joe.com. Not really Joe is the password. And we stub out on the model. And by the way, we introduced a model. The model is just a naked, plain old JavaScript object. And we're injecting it into the view when we create it. So we have a reference to it, and our reference is going to be the same as the view's reference. And we just add on to it a save property that is a Jasmine spy. And then we create a fake event. And we call create account, and we pass that event in. And here we just make sure prevent default was called. And it matters, right? If prevent default hadn't been there, you'd get a hard page refresh and everything would break. So having a test around it makes sense. And then finally, the real meat here is just to make sure that model.save was called with login, email, and password all set correctly. And we can see it pass, and we can see it fail. And the error message here is not fantastic in Safari. It's significantly nicer in Chrome, which is typical. And one of the things that I like to at least show folks, because it's easy when you're doing a live demo for everything to just work. But a lot of times, you know, when I was writing this, for example, things weren't just working all the time. I could either tell it to monitor on failures, on caught failures. In theory, maybe, yeah. And it would find me every instance where a failure was caught. Or I could write in something like the word debugger. Just add a debugger manual. I kind of prefer this because then I don't get surprised by when I'm way deep down inside of jQuery's guts and it's catching some error intentionally to get around some IE6 bug. So I usually drop in debugger lines whenever I want to. And now I've got the full force and effect of Web Inspector's awesome debugger capabilities for my test. And I can see now this.model.save. And this is what a Jasmine spy looks like under the hood. It is a function, but it's got a bunch of properties tackled onto it. So if I say call count, it'll say it was called once. If I say how many calls were made against you, you can see that it's an array of one object. That object then, what were your args? And its arguments, again, it was called once. Of that first call, it was passed with a single argument, which was an object that has email, login, password. So in some cases where you need to be really narrow, you could, if you wanted to, you could write an assertion that was literally something like this. Typically, that's not necessary now that we have decent argument matches, but that's how you interrogate spies, and it's very important for debugging, obviously, to be able to see how that thing was being touched. All right, so I'll kill that debugger. Because in actuality, now that I can see it was called to Joe, we're all good here. And we should be green again. Cool. Yeah, all right, next commit. This test doesn't need to, yeah, so I had this file just lingering around. It didn't need to be there. Add coverage to check availability. Now this one, I don't think got very much cleaner. And the fact that it was still kind of a pain, I think, told me this probably needs to get yanked out. All right, so we've got this method called check availability on the backbone view. And we're still using argument captures. This was the one that required argument captures. Yeah, so this test gets almost no less ugly than it was before. In fact, it's literally almost the exact same thing. The difference is, and the one slight improvement we were able to get over the original implementation, is the fact that we can spy on popoverwrapper.display and popoverwrapper. This one doesn't use clear, does it? So just over popoverwrapper display, we can spy on that and just have a single assertion. You know, I expected it to be called on that login input element with the text available. I expected it to be called on the login input element with that name's not taken. That name's taken. Everything else here is unfortunately the same, and the fact that it takes me 5 lines of setup and 3 lines of actual like taking action, those all tell me that I'm probably doing 2 or 3 things, and I should probably be pulling these out into separate functions that can be independently tested but do less. But I'm not going to do that today because we don't have time. And because I'm lazy and scared of trying new things in front of people. Lazy and scared at the same time is a funny mixture of emotion. Oh no. All right. What's the next commit look like here? This adds a little bit. So it adds a little bit of test to the confirm password function. And we've already written a test for this, so I'm not too concerned about us getting it right. But let's see how it changed. Again, you can see that this is a single line assertion, whereas before it was 3 lines, because we now own that scar tissue around that popover helper. We make sure it gets called with clear, for instance, in this case too. Yeah. Not a lot else going on. I mean, we create a fake event. This time we changed our fake event helper so that we can pass it a custom target, which is the password confirmation, because that's what it's reading from. But yeah, the test is mostly the same here. And I'm not sure whether this is necessarily painful enough for me to not like. I think this is very clear and straight to the point. Yep, it's pretty straightforward. We pretty much covered everything it's doing elsewheres. And what else do we got? Adds coverage to the router. And this is maybe the last interesting thing. So a brand new, what had once been a one-line test of window.location.hash equals #account/new. Now we've introduced this whole heavyweight router thing with Backbone. Testing routers can be difficult. Testing them in isolation can be difficult. And sometimes this is not worth the time. Routers, I think a lot of people would say, are just glue code. If they don't work, everyone's going to know instantly. So the regression value is relatively low. And you're under pretty tight design constraints from Backbone in terms of how a router is going to do its primary function of routing. So having isolated unit tests against them may or may not provide value. If you're going outside in, however, like I typically do, the router is going to be like one of the first places that you start. So, all right, well, let's start a new router method for a new account. Starting with a test there can help you realize what responsibilities are happening by writing out that test, and then start pushing down new actors. So it actually can be a really good place to do TDD from. But after everything's all done, when you're looking at the grand scheme of things, those tests are probably going to be independently less valuable than other ones, and maybe you can discard those. So let's see, we got this router over here. We talked through what the router's doing. Let's talk about what a spec of the router might look like. First of all, before we create it, we inject that container, because that's what the router is going to be looking at when we initialize it. So after having that side effect out of the way, we create our new router. Then, just like with the view, again, and I just like calling it measure twice, cut once, we're just making sure that the object literal of strings looks the same in both. We've got 2 methods, default route and new account. Default route, when it gets called, it should be moving the window location hash to accounts new. We could even, if we wanted to, I just am not a big fan of doing it, we could say given subject spy on subject new account, then expect subject. What I'm doing here is I'm faking out a method on the object that I'm testing to make sure that when default route is called, that it changes. Oh, it totally didn't work. Why didn't that work? It didn't work because of how Backbone works. Backbone's going to grab references to all these functions the instant that it's constructed, and so the fact that I changed this after the fact, Backbone's not aware it's still going to call the real thing. Yet another reason why it's not a great idea to fake the thing that you're testing. Just reduces your overall confidence that you're testing something real. While true, I could probably say trigger false here and still be passing, which is a little bit worrisome, because what it means is that the browser's location would have changed and this code would not have fired. But I don't have anything in my toolkit to simultaneously test that this is working how I want it to work, and not fake something on the subject. So it's just a balancing act of what you want to do. Again, you have to ask yourself what the value of each test is. And in this example today, I didn't ask that question intentionally. I just wanted to answer the question. Tactically, how do I write tests in these various situations? So the value proposition stuff is still totally contextual. That's the thing I like about little toy apps, is they have no context. But it's important, I think, to talk through them. Otherwise, it can be hard to internalize it. Finally, we've got this little new account function. This is the last bit of new code, I think, I swear. first we do a little bit of setup. We spy on the constructor. I'd previewed this before when we were talking about Jasmine Stealth. We spy on the constructor app.signupView, and we know that it's going to have methods, or we know that we're going to require methods on it, and that method is render. We sort of do all that here. That means that from this point forward, if I'm rocking out over here, if I say app.signupView, sign up view, I'm going to get an object. I'm going to get a newly instantiated object that will have on it a render method, and that render method is a spy that I control. So what I could say pretty confidently is that these two things are going to be the same reference to the function. And that just, first of all, I'm glad to know that the signup view, when I create it, isn't going to create a real signup view and potentially risk, guffing up what's going on in my test environment. But two, I can make sure that it's being used how I want it to be used, because its render function for this new object is going to be the same function that I asked for from the spy on constructor method in the first place. So I create this fake out app.signupView temporarily. I call the method directly, and then I have two expectations about how it got called. One, I expect signupView.constructor, which that is to say new got called, to have been called with first the element that is the div, that is the container, and then also with any app.signup. So here I'm making sure that the view got called with any instance of an app signup. If I cared a great deal about that app signup, like if I was passing it, Blueberry, then I could maybe make this a little bit more complex. I could say something like arg and I could say arg instance of app.signup. I could say and more ampersands and arg. Oh, excuse me. That wouldn't be the value of arg. It would be the value of this. Ugh. Yeah, this gets me messy in a hurry. Let's see. So I'd say arg.foo equals berry. The value of this is suspect. Did that even work? No. Cannot find variable app. Oh, that's frustrating. Looks like I probably have a compilation error. Indeed. Missing semicolon. Oh, am I failing JS lit somewhere along the way? Ah, right. This is not JavaScript. And this is why you should use CoffeeScript for absolutely everything. Or JavaScript for absolutely everything. But when you mix the two, sometimes I get in trouble. Expected a spy but got a function. Interesting. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on that. But that's the gist of what you would do if you cared about testing that argument in more detail. All right, now what? New account to have been called. Expected a spy but got a function. Oh, right. Forgot all about this guy. That wasn't ever going to work. Yay, now we're all green again. And thus concludes everything that I had prepared today. That leaves us with a solid 10 minutes for questions about anything. Anything at all.
So you tried using these techniques with effects and mocking up the DOM with the framework that actually handles its own DOM drawing or something like that?
Basically, my rule of thumb is if the framework's doing it for me, I don't want to write unit tests to verify that the framework's working correctly. There's a difference between dependencies that you use and dependencies that own your soul. And Ember is an example of a dependency that owns your soul. And what I mean is you play inside of its sandbox, right? So I want to have isolated unit tests around the stuff that I control. But I'm not going to build scar tissue, or I'm not going to build adapter tests or contract tests against Ember to make sure Ember is working how it's working, just because it's controlling so much of my application, but that would take me all day. And I'm just going to trust that Ember itself is well tested already. But yeah, I mean, strategically and tactically, to answer your question, yes, I still might need to throw some stuff in the DOM and make sure stuff happens, but it might not be the primary, maybe Ember or maybe my backbone framework handles the primary rendering of my template, so I don't need tests around that. For instance, I wrote a little helper called backbone fixins that just basically eliminates the need to specify a custom render function ever. So yeah, then the subclasses of that wouldn't need tests against that. But if they're doing a little bit of sniping with jQuery on some event handler, then I'd have direct tests of that and only be affixing the bare minimum of what I need to make that test pass. Anyone else struggle to find opportunities to either get serious about client-side testing or just have any issues in general when they've tried? It's been frustrating and they hit walls and then they stop doing it. And specific questions that might arise out of that situation. Patrick?
Yeah.
No, I do. I think that first of all, it's nothing that we saw today. So today was not a demo of how I do TDD. It was a demo of tactically, how do I write working tests against this stuff in a relatively isolated way. That's not going to probably answer your fundamental question. But I would say that the most important thing is to resist the urge to feel like you just need to test because testing is good, or because somebody said, hey, we should have tests around this. Instead, answer questions like, what value proposition are we trying to offer our client or our customer by having tests? And sometimes it's make sure that new deploys work when they go to production. And in that case, isolation testing might not be the best way to go. I mean, it might, by doing it aggressively and all over the place and having high coverage, I guarantee you your code's going to be higher quality and fewer bugs. But a passing isolation test suite isn't necessarily going to say that it's working in production. Having a couple smoke tests that are integration tests are going to be way cheaper to build and probably more effective at answering that question overall. So answering for yourself, what you hope to get out of tests will probably, help you identify how much motivation you've got to chew off something like this, which is a really TDD and isolation testing, I think, is a game changer for how you approach your own personal productivity. There's lots of bonuses. I came to this because I was trying to write a feature in JavaScript that was really complex, and I didn't know JavaScript very well several years ago. And TDD was a great way for me to take this big, monstrous, really gnarly problem and break it down into small bits so that I could get a little bit of green feedback quickly to say, okay, right track, wrong track, right track, wrong track. And I learned in the process. But, your mileage may vary, whether or not that's something that you feel is going to help you on this particular problem or future ones.
Do you find that your JavaScript apps you're building mostly to live in something like Lineman, or do you have to use them in the context of Rails or some larger framework? Because I find that to be hindrance in getting tests running when you're depending on the asset pipeline of Rails or something.
Yeah, so I'm not incredibly proud to be the maintainer of a gem called Jasmine Rails. What that is, I wrote it real quickly when Rails 3.1 released, because at the time the Jasmine gem didn't know anything about the asset pipeline, and I don't think Jasmine Rice had been written yet. But I was having some success with Jasmine Headless WebKit, which is a tool by John Vince, which uses Qt to run headlessly. And so what that gem does is it kind of co-ops some of the asset pipeline gunk and lets you run Jasmine tests on Rails. The reason I say I'm not completely proud is because I don't use it myself, and so I haven't been able to take great care of it, and so people do run into problems and limitations. Actually, just today I had a partner of mine run into a pretty major problem with it. I personally am just, I'm sick of us trying to solve every client-side problem and tooling issue once per server-side language, right? So as soon as I wrote a Maven plugin for Jasmine several years ago. As soon as I wrote that, people were asking me, well, where's the .NET version? Where's the link in Visual Studio? Where's the what do I do on my Python project, my PHP, or seriously, because I would go give a talk at conferences. For about a year, I was giving talks at conferences, and then people would come up after me They say, how do I get started? I'd be like, well, install Ruby and Rails and Asset Pipeline, and then realize like, oh, well, they're on Windows or they're .NET developers, and it's just not sustainable. So I really like Lineman because it's just, just JavaScript, just client side. But you're right, 99% of the applications aren't able to just flip a switch and then become pure client side. So what we just did actually, one of my clients where they were struggling with Jasmine Headless WebKit, we spent like an hour and a half, and we created a new Lineman project, but instead of actual source files over here in app JavaScript, we just made symlinks to directories in the Rails application, both the specs and the source. We were actually able to run under Lineman with Testum all of their existing specs without moving a single file in the Rails application. It worked really, really well. And we went from, not being able to debug and really big, vicious stack traces to be able to debug in Chrome, and we got the runtime down from like 15 seconds to under a second. So even just creating a new Lineman project that literally is just symlinks back to your Rails app and putting it in the same repo might be a real good quick win.